Really exciting stuff coming up over the next few weeks. As always, there's more information on our website about all of those events that are happening here at the museum. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Tamara Plakins Thornton. It's been a real pleasure getting to know her over the past couple of days. She's a lot of fun to talk to. She is a professor of history at the University of Buffalo. She was educated at Harvard and Yale and has spent the last 3 decades studying the cultural and intellectual life of America. She's written books on the history of handwriting in America, on what it means to be a country gentleman in the United States, especially in New England. And her current book that she'll be speaking about tonight is, of course, about Nathaniel Bowditch and his influence on American cultural life. Please give a warm welcome to Tamara Plakins Thornton.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's a real pleasure to come to the Mariners Museum to discuss Nathaniel Bowditch, and with Bowditchs in the audience, no less. So I have to say I've spoken in front of Bowditchs before. The man had 6 children who went on to have multiple children. It seems that the country is lousy with Bowditchs. They're all over the place. And I've gotten to know some of them, all interesting people. So over here, you can be certain they're interesting people, and I'm going to try to give you an interesting presentation on this really fascinating man. Bowditch himself would not perhaps have been so thrilled that I'm going to discuss the story of his life here. When he was on his deathbed, his daughter said to him, you know, you're a fairly famous man. There are people who are going to want to write about you. And he was horrified. And she wrote in her diary that evening how exactly he responded. He said, I do not wish to have Mr. Bowditch's feelings and views held up to people who know and care nothing about him. I do not like it. I do not want to be set up as a show like a wild animal at 6p a sight. So I should start off by giving you a picture of this wild animal here, which we need another wild animal's help. Mark may not look wild, but I've gotten to know him over the last couple of days myself, and I can assure you. So I'm just going to continue on while our wild animal here deals with the technical difficulties. So Nathaniel Bowditch, you all probably know him for his relation to the sea, and I'll certainly be talking about how he was related to the sea, but he actually had a number of careers. So here's the wild animal, looking somewhat tame, I would say, but actually he did have a kind of wild nature, and I think you'll probably see some of that. So you probably know him in his maritime career, and in particular his publication of that maritime classic, The New American Practical Navigator. I'll be talking about that, but this is a man who did in fact have a number of parallel careers. So let me just give you first just a little bit of background about him. He was born in 1773 in Salem, Massachusetts, from a long line of families who had lived in Salem since the 1600s. And the truth is that his family was a kind of downwardly mobile family. But the thing about the colonial period is that when you have relatives and friends who are well placed, you're okay. And that was pretty much the situation with Nathaniel Bowditch. He had lots of relatives and contacts who were willing to lend him a hand. That's really the way it worked in the late 1700s, and it worked well for Nathaniel Bowditch. This combination of a helping hand and some extraordinary native talent got him really quite far. So if you know anything about Salem, you know that it's a maritime town. It's a seaport. This is an image from the very early 1800s. So you can see the wharf there. there. And here you can see this is a beautiful painting that actually was painted for the East India Marine Society, which was a fairly elite society established in Salem just for captains and supercargoes who had gone around the Capes, Cape of Good Horn, or Cape Horn or Cape of Good Hope. So these were international sea captains, not ones who just went down to places like Virginia or the Caribbean. These were the big time. And this is really what Salem's wealth came from. Travel, sea voyages, commercial voyages into the Pacific and Indian Ocean. So though it's this little town of just a few thousand people, the people from Salem after the Revolution and stretching into the 1800s, so in Bowditch's heyday really, were traveling the globe. And if you could tap into that economy, you could do quite well for yourself. So Bowditch as a young man is able to get his start in that economy, and he does it first by becoming an apprentice clerk at a chandlery, which is a shop that specializes in outfitting vessels with just about everything they would need, everything from nails to cooking pots, whatever you need. You go down to the chandlery, and there you will find teenage Nathaniel Bowditch keeping the books and keeping the shop. And while he's there, he's really getting a training for the sea. This is a first step. So he also takes lessons in navigation. There are, in America at this time, 1780s and 90s, there are many men who will teach you navigation at night, kind of short vocational courses. He studies navigation, he studies bookkeeping. He's already learned the basics at common school. That's the limit of his education, okay? Which is not being ill-educated for that era whatsoever. But given what he does later on in life, it's limited. So that is what he does when he's a teenager. And then you'll remember I mentioned those well-placed relatives. Well, one of them, his mother's cousin, happened to live in that house. This was Elias Haskett Derby, who was the first millionaire in America. And Derby knew a talented young man when he saw one, and he also knew a relative when he saw one. So when Nathaniel turned 21, he said, it's time for you to be sailing on vessels that I own. You are going to head out for the Indian Ocean as the ship's clerk for a voyage bound to a tiny speck in the Indian Ocean called Réunion. This is Réunion Island as it appeared then. It's still a tiny speck in the Indian Ocean. It came up in the news recently because a little bit of wreckage from that downed Malaysian airliner washed up on its shores, and this little island came alive for a week or so in the news cycle, and we've forgotten it. So maybe every 200 years, like Brigadoon, Réunion reappears. But when Bowditch headed forward in the 1790s, this little speck in the ocean, it was an important place to go to. You could make a lot of money there because they grew coffee there. And you can see enslaved laborers dragging the coffee up and down. And this was, in fact, an island inhabited mainly by African slaves as well as by French colonials. So off he goes. This is the first of 5 voyages that he makes. He goes to Réunion, he goes to the Philippines, he goes to Indonesia, he goes to Spain, he goes to Portugal. I have to tell you that this is a man who in America never went south of Philadelphia. But he has seen the world as people see it in the 1790s. So once he returns from these voyages, and now around 1800, he develops 3 parallel careers in the sea, in science, and in business. In his time, he made a name for himself in all 3 of these careers, but his fame didn't last in all 3. If he is remembered, it's as a maritime man. So really, when we think about his 3 careers, we can think about the sea as the way he is remembered, science as the way he wanted to be remembered, And business and practical affairs, I argue, is really where he made his greatest mark. That's where he should be remembered. So let me turn first to the sea. This is how he was remembered, quite literally, because this sits on top of his grave at Mount Auburn Cemetery. So here you have Nathaniel Bowditch surrounded by navigational instruments. So he's remembered as the Navigator because he wrote this book, right? This is the New American Practical Navigator. This is an image of the first edition, which was published in 1802. And then every few years, new editions would come out. Bowditch, later on his son, would revise the Navigator. It became a standard on American vessels by the late 1810s. After the War of 1812, any American vessel would be carrying a copy of what simply became known as Bowditch. And it really was indispensable. And how indispensable was it? Well, if we listen to some advice from the 1840s on what to do if your ship wrecks, we can get some idea. So here's the advice from a book of the era. It says, if the ship cannot be saved, the passengers and crew are the first objects, with some fresh water and biscuit, a compass, quadrant, and Bowditch. And you didn't have to wait till the 1840s to find this out. You didn't have to read a book to find this out. If we go back to 1820, when a whaler from Nantucket, a whaler named the Essex, wrecked when a sperm whale destroyed it, the survivors salvaged what the first mate later called the probable instruments of our salvation. And what were these instruments? Compasses, quadrants, and Bowditch. And of course, that was the voyage that inspired Herman Melville to write Moby Dick. So yeah, Bowditch, his book, becomes absolutely indispensable by the early 19th century. Now, why was it so indispensable? What's in it? There's all kinds of stuff in it. It's really a kind of encyclopedia. If you want to find out how to do a coastal survey, it's in there. You want to find out about marine insurance, it's in there. But most of all, and if you just look at the page count, what's actually in this book? Above all, it teaches you how to locate where you are at sea so that you can plot a course and get from point A to point B safely. It teaches you navigation, and it gives you the tools to actually navigate your way from one point to another. It tells you how to establish your latitude and longitude. Now, latitude, there had been methods for finding latitude for centuries. Longitude, that was something else. It's really only around the time when Bowditch is born that you begin to get techniques for figuring out your longitude. Some of you are probably familiar with Davis Sobel's book on longitude, in which she talks about the development of the chronometer. And the chronometer we tend to remember because that's the method that became dominant in the 1800s. It's essentially an incredibly accurate watch, okay? Why does an incredibly accurate watch tell you where you are? It's because to figure out longitude, you basically have to use the sky as a clock to figure out that there's a relationship between time and space, right? The world is turning. Every hour represents 15 degrees east-west. So if you figure out time, you can figure out space. And yes, chronometers work. They were also very expensive in this era. And only the British Navy could afford it. Only East Indiamen, these massive European vessels going to India, they could afford chronometers, but not the average American sea captain, even Elias Haskett Derby. Okay, so they don't have chronometers. But there is another method, Captain Cook uses this one just as surely as he uses the chronometer, and that's the lunar method. And the lunar method relies on taking a series of astronomical observations from a deck that's going back and forth like this. You know, you hold up your quadrant or your sextant, and you actually have to try to take a measurement of what you see in the sky while you're going back and forth. So this is not easy. It's not for the faint-hearted, but it's possible. And once you get these observations, then you take those observations, the numbers from those observations, and you put them through half an hour of calculations. You don't actually have to get the math to understand what's going on. I mean, it's sort of like you don't have to be a fancy pastry chef if you've got a Duncan Hines cake mix. So the Navigator is kind of the Duncan Hines cake mix, but it does require the step-by-step formula, which you find in the Navigator, and the Navigator will teach you how to do it. And it does require a lot of tables of numbers. I mean, table after table after table of numbers in order to translate those observations into where the heck you are in the middle of the ocean. Now, here's where historical memory tends to get it wrong. Bowditch is often cited as the father of celestial navigation. You know, for the first time, sailors could find out where they were using science. Dead wrong, okay? Yes, Bowditch wrote the New American Practical Navigator, which is still published, as you can see, under his name. But before the New American Practical Navigator, there was just the plain old New Practical Navigator by Hars, an Englishman named John Hamilton Moore. And he had the same step-by-step Duncan Hines recipe, and he also had tables of numbers. So what was new? Sometimes you will read that Bowditch came up with a different, the first recipe. Okay, not true. Moore had recipes. He had these formulae for so-called working lunars. There were lots of competing techniques. Bowditch did come up with one. It's a tweak of the others. Nothing particularly original. But here's what was better about Bowditch's Navigator. Those numbers, okay? If those numbers are no good, it's shipwreck time. And what Bowditch did was go through tens of thousands of these numbers and recalculate them. And there, you know, no computers in those days, or actually there was a term computer. It referred to people who do these calculations by hand. And that's what he did. He recalculated tens of thousands of numbers, and he found 8,000 errors. Now, most of these errors were not particularly important, but some of them were, and you don't want to be the guy who's relying on the number that is an important error, right? So, yes, this really was better, and everybody understood this was a critical task, getting these numbers right. This was critical for the merchant marine, for a nation's economy, for a nation's navy, a nation's military might, to the point where in the early 1800s, a mathematician in England named Charles Babbage said, you know, we can't take any risks with doing all these calculations, but doing all these calculations and not making any errors, that is beyond human ability. That is inhuman. We need a machine to do this. He said, let's do them by steam. And so he invented what historians consider to be the very first computer. So the first mechanical computer, and this is a model of it that's in a museum in London. So the origin of computer science, actually, and computer technology, is in this need to get those numbers right. Now, Babbage thought that this was inhuman. Human beings couldn't do this kind of calculating, but Bowditch loved calculating. He was known in his day for all kinds of mathematical tricks, you know, feats of mental math. People would actually place bets. Can he do this? Here's a really tough one. Can he do this? So, for example, he was on the island of Madeira, and his sea captain, his commanding officer, sort of put him forward. Look what my Bowditch can do. Give him a really tough problem. So they gave him a tough problem, and it had to do with taking a particular sum of money and moving it from bank to bank and country to country and currency to currency when there is no decimal currency, right? Moving it over years. This was an actual case that an accountant had been working on for quite a while. They said, okay, now at the end of all of that, how much money do you have? So Bowditch stood up and he squeezed his fingers together and he took 2 minutes and he said, 843 pounds, 4 pence, and a farthing. And the accountant was at that dinner party, and he jumped up and he said, there's not a man on this island that can do it in 2 hours. If there is, I will suffer death. So needless to say, the sea captain won his bet. And in those days, the ability to do that kind of mental math, that was seen as genius. Not having original ideas like Einstein. No, it was if you can do these calculations, you are a genius. So at the time, this is how Bowditch was seen. So, okay, Bowditch was not the father of celestial navigation. He wasn't particularly original when it came to mathematics, but that love of numbers that regards acting like a machine, churning out numbers, doing them all the time, that's what drove him. That was his talent. That was really his personality. Numbers, numbers, numbers. So that's why he really wanted to be remembered not as a navigator, but as a man of science. And here we have, this was actually where he conducted his scientific researches at his home in Salem, Massachusetts. And it's interesting to see that the desk that he stood at was actually very much like a merchant's desk. Merchants in that era, they wouldn't sit down at a desk. They would basically stand at something like what I'm standing at, a podium with a big feather pen and all that stuff. Well, that's how he did his science. And that's how he wanted to be remembered, as a scientist. He considered his Navigator what he called a merely practical manual. And what he wanted was to be part of the international world of science. He wanted to run with the big boys, and that meant to be recognized by Europeans as a scholar, an astronomer, a mathematician, on par with European astronomers and European mathematicians. But in this day and age, we're now talking about the first few decades of the 1800s, America was seen as a complete cultural backwater. And the idea that anybody would look to the United States of America for somebody who was au courant in mathematics, astronomy, science, to Europeans, that was an absolute joke. Now, in America, Bowditch did in fact develop quite a major reputation. He was offered a faculty position at Harvard. He turned it down. He was given a couple of honorary degrees by Harvard. Remember, this is a man who never had a college education. Thomas Jefferson described him as a meteor in the hemisphere. Another gentleman of the era described him as the American Isaac Newton. So what exactly were his achievements? Well, it is quite an achievement to be self-taught, and he was self-taught. He managed to get his way through the real Isaac Newton, had to learn Latin in order to do it, but he did it. There happened to be a quite state-of-the-art scientific library in Salem. He had friends who let him in. The friends always help. He reads the books. He teaches himself this stuff. He taught himself calculus, the Newtonian version, which in those days was called fluxions. He takes out the book on fluxions from that Salem library, teaches it to himself. And later on, even more remarkably, he teaches himself an even more up-to-date version of calculus, not Newton's version, but a much more recent cutting-edge version coming out of France, differential calculus. I am not going to try to explain the difference to you, but I'm going to show you the difference because you will see it's very obvious visually. This is what fluxions looks like. It's lots of shapes, okay? And this is what the new French calculus looks like. Okay, this is what I struggled through in high school. Okay, maybe I should turn this off. I'm seeing panic attacks among a few of you here. This is what he taught himself, and he was only among a handful handful of Americans in this era who knew this. Now you might say, well, surely people back at Harvard knew this kind of mathematics. So the next image I'm going to show you is the senior mathematics thesis of a Harvard senior from Bowditch's era. This is the thesis. This is the entire thesis. This is the state of mathematical knowledge among Harvard graduates in this era. It's not until the first decade of the 19th century that Harvard requires arithmetic as a prerequisite to admission. So Bowditch, the fact that he knew this cutting edge stuff, pretty amazing. That's an achievement, but you're probably not going to get a lot of kudos from Europeans for that. So what else was he doing? Well, he published a bunch of articles in a local scientific periodical, mainly about comets and meteors, observations and calculations that he made. But his major accomplishment, and what he considered his major accomplishment, was the translation and annotation of a multi-volume work by this man, Pierre de Laplace, who's a Frenchman. And probably a lot of you are thinking, Pierre de la who? Well, in his day, Pierre de Laplace was one of the most famous scientists ever. He put together a synthesis of physics and astronomy and mathematics called Mécanique Céleste, celestial mechanics. It was kind of the Bible of Enlightenment science. And mathematically, it put forward this vision of the solar system as this wonderfully regular, perfect, predictable clockwork mechanism. This is an orrery, which is a demonstration device of the era. You can go into the other galleries and you can see orreries. But this was the idea that the solar system is not chaotic and unpredictable. It runs like a perfect clock. In fact, it's better than a good clock because it never needs rewinding and it never breaks. So it's a predictable, regular, law-abiding system. And Bowditch, this man of numbers, was enthralled with Laplace's celestial mechanics. He loved numbers, he loved system. And to him, these were the big lessons of Laplace. Did Bowditch actually get international recognition? Well, he was made a fellow of the Royal Society in London. They made a very big deal about that in America. It was a huge deal. Unfortunately, he probably got the FRS because of friends. He had friends who had friends in London who put his name forward. When I was actually at the Royal Society in London and I looked at the nomination papers, and I compared them to the nomination papers of some really very distinguished French scientists of the era, the French scientists were being nominated for their great genius and accomplishments in this, that, and the other. And the nomination papers for Bowditch were basically the equivalent of, I guess he'll do. But nevertheless, he was made an FRS, and when he published his English translation and annotation, he got letters from his European science heroes, and he was thrilled. A lot of those letters were basically saying things like, amazing from an American, who knew? But that's not the way Bowditch wanted to take it, so he didn't take it. Now, there are problems here for your long-term scientific reputation. Translation, annotation is difficult work, it's not original work, and that's what we tend to remember. And there's another longer-term problem here, and that is who remembers Laplace? This is the wrong horse to bet on, right? So we don't really remember Bowditch as a scientist. We do remember him as a mariner. So how should he be remembered? I believe he should be remembered as a businessman. And here is State Street in Boston. It's basically the Wall Street of Boston in this era. And Bowditch was actually a corporate executive. He ran a couple of large financial corporations in his day, one in Salem, and then in the 1820s and 30s, another one in Boston, which was in its time the largest financial institution in New England, which is saying something. something. This was basically a kind of J.P. Morgan Chase or Prudential Financial of its era. And it's kind of hard to imagine what Prudential Financial would do today with an astronomer, but actually Bowditch was hired because he was a man of numbers. One contemporary described him this way: Dr. Bowditch was a man of great order and system. He could not tolerate anything like negligence or irregularity. He doubtless had himself acquired this habit from the nature of his favorite study, mathematics, which is peculiarly suited to form habits of exactness and precision. So if you want somebody running your office, running your business, actually a Laplacian scientist is a good place to go. Nevertheless, the people who hired Bowditch didn't exactly know what they were in for. He shook things up. What happens when a Laplacian scientist who loves numbers and system takes over an institution? Well, he turns that institution into a clockwork mechanism. And this is not the way business worked before this era. So let me give you some sense of how it did work. This is what an office would have looked like in the era. This is a wharfside office. There's no document organization system here. You can see ledger books on the bookshelves, and in them you will find copies of outgoing letters. If you want to find a letter you've written before, you kind of, since everything is in chronological order, you have to remember when you might have sent it and what will be in that letter. It might be business having to do with 5 different businesses. And it might also have personal information. You know, say hello to your wife, hope her sciatica is better. There was no distinction between business and personal stuff. You look in the books, okay, in the bookkeeping of this era, and you will have Elias Haskett Derby, that big merchant who's describing his purchase of coffee in Réunion, but also wallpaper for his wife's parlor. So it doesn't look very businesslike to us, okay? What else is in this office? Well, what happens to all those incoming letters? Well, they go on spindles, they go in boxes, then who knows where they go. This is no paper clips, no file folders, no file cabinets, nothing, okay? Very, to our way of looking at things, really quite disorganized. There are no routinized paperwork procedures. If you want a loan, you want a mortgage, you want some sort of business proposal, you want a receipt for your payment, maybe you'll get a handwritten something or another, maybe it's just a conversation. This is how business worked in Bowditch's era. Okay, and here we see a handwritten receipt. This was actually done behind Bowditch's back, but at the company that he ran. This would have horrified him because he gave very specific orders, nothing handwritten to be given out. Okay, instead, one of the first things he did when he moved into the CEO position in 1823 in Boston was to have a bunch of printed forms printed up. Now, our lives run on printed forms today. Some of you probably registered for coming to this talk online, right? It's one printed form after another. So we are used to this, but there were very few of these kinds of things in that era. Bowditch comes in. He immediately starts an organizational system for organizing documents. He tells all of his agents, I want you to number every single loan, and I want you to refer to each loan by its number, and every letter should have only one loan and its number, and write that on the outside, because I'm going to bundle them all up by number in little bundles. It's an early filing system. It looks primitive to us, but it was earth-shaking at the time. He separates office business from personal business. He does these blank forms. He has annual audits. That was a new thing. All kinds of things that to us are now standard operating procedure, he introduces. And the way he runs not just the office, but the business is also quite earth-shaking. So, for example, in the era in which he was raised, things like due dates for loans, they were, you know, more like suggestions. Not if you're running a clockwork universe, right? You can't have suggestions when it comes to navigation. You can't have suggestions when it comes to figuring out the solar system. These things run precisely, predictably, regularly. That's how he wants his business to run. So one example is that he has one very wealthy man who has borrowed money from the company. The man doesn't pay his interest on the due date. This is a very powerful man in Boston, and he happens to have gone on vacation that weekend to the seaside. Well, Bowditch doesn't care. He sends a messenger off to the man's hotel and says, "Where's the money?" And the man is absolutely shocked. This has never happened to him before. He said, "You know, I thought I would pay it when I would pay it. Do you know who I am, Mr. Bowditch?" And Mr. Bowditch says, "Yes, I know who you are, and I also know what date it is, and that money is late." This is an institution that runs by rules, and rules are rules. They run like clockwork. And there are 100 stories like this about how Bowditch enforced the letter of the law time after time. He wanted to have numbers and system. This is a man who's introducing what we're very familiar with, an impersonal bureaucracy, right? We don't call Visa or MasterCard and say, "Well, I'll pay you after the vacation ends. Do you care?" Yeah, they would care. So we live with all kinds of numbers: Social Security numbers, driver's license, credit cards, zip codes, PINs, everything. And we're used to systems, we're used to due dates, we're used to impersonal bureaucracies. This is modern life to us, but life doesn't become modern by something dropping out of the sky. Real human beings make life modern. And Nathaniel Bowditch is one of the people who made American life modern. So if you want to remember what's important about him, it's really not so much his practical navigator. This is the man who introduces numbers and system into American life to make American life modern. Now, people didn't accept it right away. It took a while for people to get used to this way of life. Bowditch offended a lot of people. One of the institutions that he ran across and had some power in that was not running like clockwork was Harvard University. That's a kind of powerful institution, then as now. And when he found himself on the governing board in the late 1820s, he was horrified by what he found. The books were a complete mess. The president was spending money without recording it, without having permission, without separating his own private bank accounts from Harvard's bank accounts. There were no minutes being taken of meetings, or if they were on little pieces of paper. Drove Bowditch absolutely insane. And he said, "We have to clean house here." And man, he did clean house. Out went the steward, out went the treasurer, out went the president. This was very controversial because this is not how gentlemen do things. And Bowditch basically said, "The heck with being a gentleman, I'm going to make this thing run like clockwork." So he ruffled a lot of feathers, but you know what? He got Harvard on sound financial footing. Harvard is known for the size of its endowment, starting from Bowditch's days. Okay? He put in a card catalog system in the library. He had decent records, annual reports made, all these kinds of things that are the hallmarks of any institution. He is the one who introduces them and makes them standard operating procedure. So people do begin to get used to it. Now, if you listen to this description of Nathaniel Bowditch, you might think a man of number, a man of system. This is really a stone kind of person, and this was actually a bust that was made of Bowditch in the 1830s. This is a kind of automaton, but actually he was in no way a man of stone, and this is one of the delights of working on a biography and going into a man's personal papers and and his wife's diaries and letters that he sends to friends, you actually begin to get a sense of the human being. And he was anything but a person of stone. So, for example, I found his wife's travel diary from 1813. She and Nathaniel go up to New Hampshire. And as I opened up the diary, flower petals fell out of it. And I looked at what she had written, and she'd written in there, "Plucked by my husband." And I thought, isn't that romantic? Here they've been married for quite a while. This man of stone is in love with his wife. He's picking flowers for his wife, and she's saving them all these years. And it felt like a real privilege to receive these petals. It was quite an amazing moment. It was also amazing when I read letters that he wrote about his children. You know, his eldest son, Nat, here's a man, Nathaniel, right, who has never been to college. He wants his sons to go to college, doesn't want to have them struggle the way he had to. So he really pushes this boy. He tutors him in math, he tutors him in Latin, he tutors him in Greek. He learns Greek so that he can teach Nat Greek. And so little Nat goes off to college at age 13. Now, students went to Harvard quite young in that era, but not 13. Little Nat was the youngest in his class. And he lacked some maturity, shall we say. So within a couple of years, little Bowditch, as his schoolmates knew him, got into trouble. What did Nat do? Well, you know, just things like setting fire to an outhouse. Then he got throwing a cannonball. This comes from the faculty disciplinary records. Throwing a cannonball from an upper window of one of the colleges on the step of the door, accompanied with deliberate insult to a college officer. You just wish you knew what that deliberate insult was. But trust me, Nathaniel and his wife Mary were wringing their hands. They were just typical parents. As much as you can relate to the flower petals, you can relate to these over-anxious parents who see their boy not doing so well in his freshman year of college. And Nathaniel himself, although he believed in being rule-bound and he ran all of his institutions as if he were Pierre de Laplace himself, he was not so rule-bound in his life. He was famous for jumping up with glee and rubbing his hands and running around and pulling his wife up from her chair and dancing around. None of this particularly gentlemanly behavior seemed as far too spontaneous, but that was Bowditch. He liked his wine. He liked to drink. He drank 2 glasses of wine twice a day, total of 4 glasses. That's what he called his certain quantity. I absolutely love that pun. He was certain to drink it, and of course he liked mathematical certainty. And one final quirk about Bowditch, he liked to race with carts and carriages till their wheels rubbed together. He was a danger on the roads. And the man who actually carved this bust, a sculptor named John Frazee, unfortunately didn't know that about Bowditch when he accepted Bowditch's invitation to go for a ride. And Frazee later wrote a letter to his wife. He said the two of them hopped into the gig and off we went like Old Scratch meaning the devil. And they go through the streets of Boston and almost knock over another carriage and get knocked over themselves. So there we have it, Nathaniel Bowditch, the navigator, the scientist, the business executive, and the drag racer. So thank you all for your attention to Nathaniel Bowditch, and I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.
We'll go ahead and take questions. I have a microphone here. If you are interested in asking a question, please raise your hand. I'll bring a microphone over to you. We'll start with this gentleman back here. Please wait until you have the mic before you ask a question.
Just curious, on the diary with the pressed flowers, what is it that said he was doing that as a human being for his wife versus a botanist trying to save a new
I'm sorry, what was that?
As a human being bringing flowers to his wife versus being a botanist who wanted her to press these flowers so he could bring it back for scientific purposes.
Yeah, no, he wasn't a botanist. In fact, his son later wrote, his son Henry was quite a romantic character who loved the natural world. And in Henry's diary, he said, I love the natural world, but my father was completely the opposite. You could take him to a beautiful landscape and he would have absolutely no interest in it. So we know that if he picked his wife flowers, it was not for the sake of botanical specimens. Perhaps she might have been interested in botanical specimens, but I think what I know about Mary, probably not. I think he was being romantic, and we do have a few letters between the two of them. They're very loving. He always writes to her as my dearest Mary, and hug my dear children for me. So he had, for his family, he was actually a very warm-hearted, loving person. But aesthetic sense, absolutely not. To him, what was aesthetic? Numbers. That's what moved him.
How much later did he write his book, The Navigator, than when the Moore publication came out?
Okay, Moore, I think Moore's book, like Bowditch's book, comes out in a number of editions. So I think Moore's book first comes out in the, but don't quote me on this, I think it's late 1770s or early 1780s. Before Bowditch writes his first edition, New American Practical Navigator, under his name, what he actually does is revise Moore, and it's the 13th edition of Moore that he revises, and it's still published under Moore's name. At that point, his publisher in Newburyport, Massachusetts says, you know what, these numbers are much better, and I bet you could make them even better if you fixed even more of them, so why don't you do one under your own name? So Moore had been around for a couple of decades in America. And of course, to say this is not an original book is no insult. How you can't be, if you try to be original about numbers, you're going to run into trouble, right? If you try to be original about a mathematical formula, that's not going to work. So it's simply in the nature of the beast that this has to be rewritten and rewritten.
I was wondering, all these newfangled methods of doing business like filing and numbering and organizing, where do you think those ideas came from?
Yes, where did those ideas come from? A lot of those ideas came from science, actually. If you look at scientific laboratory notebooks from this period, for example, they look a lot like bookkeeping, and bookkeeping looks a lot like scientific notebooks. So there's this back and forth between the world of science and the world of business. Bowditch had one foot in both areas, which a lot of people didn't, and so he was a particularly good individual to allow for that kind of cross-fertilization. So it's coming from science. If you look at his comet notebooks, for example, they follow a lot of the kinds of organizational techniques, alphabetizing things, paginating pages, this sort of stuff. This is what scientists were doing. And to some extent, what you have is cross-fertilization that then Bowditch is able to put into warp speed and just move forward beyond what other scientists and merchants who didn't have one foot in both worlds was able to do.
Yes, ma'am. Knowing him as you do, how do you think he would react to today's technology of GPS and inertial navigation systems and electronic charts?
Well, we actually have a fairly good idea of that because we know how he responded to chronometers. Okay, and chronometers, as he's one edition of the Navigator is coming out after another, he doesn't die until 1838. By the 1820s, 30s, chronometers are cheap enough. Absolutely, you can get a decent chronometer. You even find advertisements for chronometers at the back of his book, put in there by his publisher. But Bowditch resists. He says, no, you can't really rely on chronometers. The only thing you really can rely on is this beautiful clockwork universe. So I think technology by itself is not something that he would have liked. GPS, though, okay? GPS, because it is relying, to some extent, on the clockwork universe, he might have felt differently about that. But he didn't want people doing shortcuts. He thought, if it's got numbers in it, if it's got system in it, then that is the way to go. So a watch, a chronometer, just seemed like cheating to him. So I have a feeling he probably would still be pushing for celestial navigation. The interesting thing is I have heard, and I don't know if this is true, and maybe some of you, if you're connected with the Navy or the military, maybe you know better. I have heard that there is a concern that we not just rely on GPS, because after all, this stuff can be hacked. And you don't want to be a vessel at sea with no backup, right? And there's no longer the Loran method. Who has a chronometer anymore? So we may be going back to celestial navigation after all.
It was just put back in the curriculum at the Naval Academy.
Was it? Okay, all right. So this gentleman is saying that celestial navigation was just put back in the curriculum at the Naval Academy. Let me tell you, Bowditch is jumping up and squeezing his hands with joy underneath that statue of him as Navigator, I promise you.
I'm wondering, I noticed in the book that you showed that Bowditch wrote first, it had the nautical almanac. That was in there, and then, or were there other people that were calculating nautical almanac?
There were other people calculating these tables in Greenwich, England. Bowditch went through all those numbers too and found a lot of problems. And evidently in the late 18th century, those numbers were fairly reliable, but by the early 19th century, they were going downhill. Greenwich wasn't running like clockwork anymore. And this is when he begins to find lots of problems. So Bowditch is the book, the one book you need with all the right numbers in it.
Ma'am, you talked about his ability to relate to his family, but also this book that I have here, the 1943 edition Bowditch, that was taught to my class. In it, in the opening bio on him, it tells of his going on a trip to sea where he winds up teaching everybody on the ship, including the ship's cook, how to navigate by the end of the voyage. So it would appear that he could relate to the average sort of semi or untrained individual, to people like me, for instance.
Right. Well, that's a story that's circulated a long time. So, and I wanted to see, is that true? Okay, because there are stories that circulate that have been borne out, and then others that haven't been borne out. So I looked at that one, and I looked to see who's on the crew, and that story refers to a particular voyage, actually. We happen to have the list of the crew. We know who was on it. We also have a letter that Bowditch wrote describing that crew, and in it he actually says some fairly disparaging things about that crew, that they're basically a bunch of riffraff, but we'll whip them into shape and some sort they'll do. The riffraff included African Americans, and most cooks on commercial vessels in this era were African Americans. Also in that story is everybody he taught later rose up to at least the rank of mate and captain. Well, this we can trace, and this we can see is not, in fact, true. I think what's much more likely is that there are expectations that certain people who go on vessels in this era are, like Bowditch himself, candidates for mobility. You start off at the bottom, but you come from the right family, you've got the right background, you will learn navigation, and over time you will become a mate or a captain, just as Bowditch did. But some people didn't belong to that category. So when you look at who's on this vessel, there are Filipinos there. No, they didn't make it to mate. The African-American cook, no. So that story is often told, I think, because people like to think of the Navigator as an inherently democratic book. Anybody who's got this book can teach it to himself, and he can move ahead in this world. It fits in with our ideas that in America, anybody can move ahead if you work hard and teach yourself. And to some extent, Bowditch is held up as an example of just that. Well, he did teach himself a lot. He also had a lot of helping hands, right? So it was talent and help. And the same thing with the book. It was a very useful book. You could learn a lot from it, but just having the book was not going to get you to be a captain. So there's a mix there. There is a mix.
Thank you.
One quick question. He wasn't, I guess he wasn't a contemporary, but how much of an influence did Bowditch have on Matthew Fontaine Maury?
Yes. Well, Maury, of course, knew Bowditch. Maury was interested in, remember I compared Bowditch's book to a Duncan Hines recipe. Maury, as a person who was interested in the professional status of the Navy, felt that, Duncan Hines cake mixes were beneath the dignity of naval officers. They should learn the theory. So he actually has some issues with Bowditch and Bowditch's book. On the other hand, everybody knows that Bowditch, the book, is the thing that you need. That it really, those numbers are the things you need. So kind of a mixed relationship there.
Can you tell me, or us, how Thomas Jefferson learned about Bowditch and why he thought he was I've forgotten the phrase you use.
A meteor in the hemisphere.
Yes,
yeah,
that's it.
Thomas
Thank you.
Jefferson. That's a really interesting story because you don't have to be in the 21st century to find political polarization. All you have to do is go back to Thomas Jefferson's era. And on one side was Thomas Jefferson, and on one side was the party that Bowditch was very involved in and really was quite politically active. So this is oil and water. Okay, and to have Thomas Jefferson complimenting a scientist who represents and is active in the oppositional party, astounding. What explains that is the belief in this era that science and learning should be above politics. It should be above region. It should be above religion. It should be above national boundaries. The French and the English, when they were fighting the Napoleonic Wars, continued to honor each other's scientists. So it was the same thing with Jefferson and Bowditch. And the two are actually in touch with each other all through the most politically difficult era. It's really because of this common bond in science. So you have Jefferson finds out about Bowditch in part because he owns the Navigator, in part because he knows Laplace. He's an educated man. He also knows people of his own political party who know Bowditch and who say, hey, this guy's really smart and you should see what he does. He's really good at doing comet trajectory calculations and so on. And at one point, Bowditch gets in touch with Jefferson in the 1800s, I think. I can't remember the exact date. He says there's a comet coming up, or not a comet, there's a meteor coming up, or maybe it's an eclipse, I can't remember. And I want all educated men in America to take observations and then send me that data. And he doesn't care if you are of the Federalist Party, the Jeffersonian Party, if you're from Virginia, if you're from Massachusetts, he doesn't care. This is what they call the Republic of Letters, that international community of science and learning. So he's in touch with Jefferson, and sure enough, Jefferson sends him the data. It's entirely civilized. Meanwhile, Bowditch is developing this reputation. So Jefferson has respect for him, not as the President of the United States, not as a gentleman of Virginia, but as the President of the American Philosophical Society, which is the big scientific society of the day. He's impressed with Bowditch, to the point where he actually offers Bowditch a job at the University of Virginia. Which Bowditch says no to that one too. But it's really, they know each other because they're both in the world of science, and they are ready and willing and able to put aside politics for the most part and relate to each other as fellow intellectuals, fellow men of learning. It's very admirable, I have to say.
All right, well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. There are copies of Dr. Thornton's book available in the shop, and Dr. Thornton will be heading out to the table to sign copies for you momentarily. So thank you all for being here tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks for the next lecture in our series.
Thank you so much.